Well, hello and welcome. I'm Stephen Perloff, the editor of the Photo Review. And before I start the introduction, I will remind you of several things. We are filming this evening. Steven Spielberg himself, I think. I'm also to remind you to turn off your cell phones. And lastly, we will hold questions till the end of Matthew's presentation. And when you ask a question, wait for them to bring a mic to you, because if you just shout it out, they can't really hear you. Well, I'll tell you just a bit about the Photo Review, since this is the commercial before the main event. The Photo Review is a nonprofit journal of photography, founded in 1976, which means this is our 40th anniversary. We publish a newsletter which lists photography exhibitions throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and news about photography from around the world. And we also have a journal that has exhibition reviews, book reviews, essays, and publishes the winners of our annual competition. Well, most of you probably know Matthew, so I will just give a brief introduction. Matthew has had an interest in abandoned sites since he was a child. We won't go into the psychology of that, but all good. But he started documenting them a decade ago while researching the decline of the state hospital system. After Matthew received his MFA from the Rochester Institute of Technology, he has shown his work in gallery shows across the country, lectured on abandoned spaces and mental health history for numerous institutions, been profiled in various publications and on various media, and his website, Abandoned America, has gained international attention and is considered one of the leading collections of images of abandoned spaces on the internet. But we're here today to launch Matthew's latest book of Abandoned America, second volume. And as you look through these images, both in print and in the book, you will see a very accomplished eye in terms of creating a photograph within a rectangle. Matthew's vision really gets to the heart of the matter in terms of composition, in terms of color, and of course, in terms of the content. And that's what's really important about the work. There are many people who have and continue to photograph abandoned spaces, and you might have a beautiful image of an abstract pattern of paint on a wall or an abandoned glove left on a factory floor. But what Matthew does is remind us of the lives that once inhabited these spaces. The only thing that is constant in our lives is change. None of these spaces, industries, homes, hospitals, was necessarily meant to last forever, nor does anything particularly last forever. But it's how we treat these places, what we expect out of them, and how we plan for the institutions that succeed them. It's especially appropriate in this political campaign season. I grew up in upstate Pennsylvania in coal mining country. The coal industry has been disappearing for years. Despite what politicians will say, coal is not coming back. There's nothing you can do to save it. It is a victim of improving technologies, of market forces that drive down the price of coal. And certainly for the many miners who are losing their jobs, we have to figure out how to retrain them and get them to industries that need them. But for all those miners who had black lung, who were injured, had friends, family members killed in the mines, it's not that bad a thing on one level. Same with factory jobs. We need to think about what the future holds and how we can make that happen. And personally, I think that Matt's photographs really show us the elegance of what has been, but leaves us with that question of what will follow. My pleasure to introduce Matthew Christopher.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm really grateful to have all of you here. It means a lot to me that you'd come out and sort of share this evening with me. So I'm excited to talk to you about my new book. Before I do, I have several people to thank. I mean, I have actually a million people to thank, but a few that will keep the evening, running on schedule. I'd like to thank my family and my lovely fiancée, Olivia, both of whom have helped tremendously with this event. I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event. Those sponsors are Entertaining Grace. Entertaining Grace, if you're looking at the lovely setup out there and the catering and all the decorations and everything, that is Entertaining Grace. So you can look up Entertaining Grace online, and if you have any wonderful events that you would like to have, they're the ones to do it. The Athenaeum of Philadelphia and Partners for Sacred Places. Also, our community partner, the Gershman Y. Obviously, I'd love to thank the Photo Review and Stephen Perloff for coming out and being a part of this evening. That is really an honor to me. The sites like Artblog and NLiquid that helped get the word out about the event. All of you who have come out here, supported the book, the work, people who have reviewed the book, and people who are here to share this evening with me. Also, Eric O'Hara and Danielle Burrows, who both helped me quite a bit with editing the book, and C-SPAN for being here tonight with us, especially Rich, who held the door for us about 10 million times today as we were bringing things in and out. Thank you, Rich. So anyway, this is pretty great night, not just in terms of the book being out and finally done, which I have to tell you that is pretty great for me, not as some sort of big life accomplishment, but just being finished with it because it was a lot of work. But also, this is the 10-year anniversary of my website. So my website, Abandoned America, which is where we got the title for the books that I have, Dismantling the Dream, which is the current one, and Age of Consequences, which was my first book. That is basically a catalog of all the different sites that I've been to, or at least as many of them as I've processed and have added online. So it's kind of a never-ending thing that I'm building. Usually in the beginning, I like to give people a little bit of an idea just to give you some of the breadth of the places that I've been to. This is an entirely new collection of images, so we'll experience it together. This is a China plant that I've been to. All of those various forms there are used to make the plates and dishes. They're quite heavy. That's why they're sinking through the floor. You're looking at Bethlehem Steel's gas blowing room right there. If you go out to get Bethlehem Steel now, you can see the steel stacks and all the restoration work that they did. If you go up on the Hoover Mason trestle, you can look down into this room. But when I went there in like 2008, 2009, the whole facility was completely abandoned. This is Alcoa Aluminum, one of the locations in my first book. That's Frederick, Maryland. This is the Fisher Body Plant in Detroit. So if you ever see Body by Fisher stamped on your car, that's where they did it. Apparently, this is like 2008-ish when I took this. Apparently, a good chunk of the facade of that fell off. This is a lime quarry in Marietta, Pennsylvania. The Hershey Chocolate Factory. That one is one that is really kind of a poignant one for me because I spent a good portion of my youth growing up in Hershey, and my father worked there. He didn't work in the factory, he worked in the IT section, but still, really integral to the identity of the town. They did build a newer facility, so it's not like they went bankrupt or something, but this is the iconic one that was, Milton Hershey's baby when he founded it. This is the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, one of the recent ones that I photographed. Major urban newspaper, they moved their offices out into the suburbs. So basically, this whole facility, which has these 3-story printing machines like this, is being dismantled as we speak. This is Bell Labs. That's in my first book. Bell Labs is the place that you have to thank for a myriad of technologies, including satellite, microwave, cellular technology, laser technology. They're the ones who developed the Holmdel horn, which is what they verified the Big Bang with. Scranton lace no longer looks like this. But at the time, these were all Nottingham looms that they had that were all threaded with the lace that they were making when it closed. It was a really wonderful room. One of them remains, and it's not in very good condition. LeBeau Brothers Clothing Factory. People frequently ask me why there are so many things left over. In a case like this with LeBeau, you had thousands of coats in there, and the reason that the place closed is because guys don't wear suit jackets that much to work anymore. So they weren't doing the same business they did. If they are closed because of debt, then everything inside is more or less seized to potentially pay off debtors, right? Coats are chump change to a bank. They don't really matter to them. This is Baltimore Gas and Electric's Westport Generating Station. Westport Generating Station was where they consolidated all of their gas and electric into one building at the time. It was the largest reinforced concrete building in the world. It was made out of reinforced concrete so that if there was a fire or anything blew up, the whole place wouldn't burn down. Power plants and water stations, public utilities, actually have some of the greatest architecture that you'll ever see. They're gorgeous buildings, which I always think is really kind of astonishing because they're places the public really doesn't get to see. And of course, they have areas like this sub-basement, where you just have kind of a steampunk nightmare of toxins, you know, is probably what that is. So I've been to a number of resorts. This resort, for example, if you were to go over to the other side of the hallway, you would see that the room on the other side of the hall is actually in pretty good condition. You could put sheets on the bed and you might not be able to tell it from a regular hotel. That is because this side of the building has water coming through and the other side does not. This is another resort that I've been to. I'm going to have to confess that I've read the name. I haven't actually heard it spoken. Eric Freen, the guy who shot some of the Pennsylvania State Troopers and then was on the lam for a while. They had a big manhunt for him. This resort is where they found him. I don't assume that he slept on that bed because it doesn't look all that safe. That hotel was burned by an arsonist. That's in Bellefonte, PA. Really gorgeous, gorgeous building. And one of the things that I point out in my other, kind of my previous talk, I have a, kind of previous presentation, I have a whole spiel on why abandoned buildings will kill you, so therefore you should not go in them. But I'm condensing that. This is all new stuff, guys. So right here, though, I will point out that's a hole in the stairs. This whole stairway is carbonized. So really, I mean, there's a very good chance at any point going up that stairway, you would just go right through it and probably punch through the one below it and then, be in a world of hurt beneath it. So smart people really don't go up stairways. I do. This is one of the many churches that I've been to. It's in quite good condition. And the thing about churches that I think is really stand out is that they're kind of works of art. I mean, they're built to be works of art. Whether or not you share the faith or not of the church doesn't matter as much to me. I mean, in Philadelphia in particular, they're an endangered species, but much more so in other cities as well. I mean, this is in the Pittsburgh area. And, the neighbors that are around it are very worried about, even though they don't want to lose the building, they're very worried about bricks falling off of it or, like a predator kidnapping somebody and bringing them in there. This building, also in the Pittsburgh area, is the Holy Trinity Church, and the whole middle section of that church just recently collapsed. And they actually had to evacuate portions of the neighborhood around it because they were worried essentially about the whole front of the building collapsing onto them, which would have been pretty bad. This is St. Boniface Church in Philadelphia, one of the churches in my first book. St. Boniface, I was actually really lucky. Chris Stock of Philadelphia Salvage got me into this building as they were demolishing it. I had been trying to get in there for 5 years 5 years. And I couldn't get a hold of anybody. And so I got in at this last minute. Well, they were right in the middle. They had ripped the apps off of the building, and this was essentially what was left. This is another church that I've been to. This one right here, the interesting thing about that is that there was a small fire. You can actually see the remains of it in the lower left-hand corner. And it didn't do a lot of structural damage, but it did do a lot of soot damage. So the whole church, aside from being really, really dark because of the windows, there being a lack of light in it, also was sort of pitch black. So it had this really nightmarish kind of feel to it, very surreal. I have been to a good many homes. In fact, so many abandoned homes that if I had $1 for each of them, I could probably stop writing books and just be at home playing Xbox right now. It'd be great. The homes that I've been to, sometimes, they're really parts of whole neighborhoods, like this one. This was a miners' village that, yes, that horse is real, by the way. I did not digitally insert that horse. If I did, he probably would be in front of the tree. Anyway, it's an owned area. A guy has bought it and really wants to kind of bring it back to some sort of like Williamsburg-esque kind of historic village. I don't know whether that's going to succeed or not, but it was definitely very interesting because you had a bunch of horses wandering around that I was not supposed to pet and yet came up like right in my face. So I was kind of like, oh, I must not pet you, horse. Don't bite me. Some of the homes are full of people's items in them. And, I think homes of all places really give you the most intimate portrait of who people are. So, you find these effects that are there, and sometimes they just really tell you, little secrets about people that I think are interesting. And that's one of the things in my work that's really important, is kind of trying to find those little stories that people have, Some of the homes are in quite good condition. Like I said, they can be in whole neighborhoods. This neighborhood right here, many of the homes recently burned in an arson, which is unfortunately something you kind of see happen again and again in abandoned places. So I don't know if this home in particular is gone, but it's pretty likely. Schools, I've been to quite a few schools. I think schools are sometimes the most difficult. Personally, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this school, they really represent an investment of the community, and they're a source of pride, and they mean a lot to people. And one thing that I sort of talk about, too, is that, you basically, when you're, the school that you went to, if you were to go back to that school now, you might have all sorts of memories jarred loose. Oh, that was that weird kid that sat next to me that always would throw his pencil at me. Or you remember when the teacher said this one thing. So we really have these connections to buildings that when they're gone, in a way it's kind of erasing a part of our own identity. This building, luckily, is it's McKissick & Associates, a Harrisburg-based firm, has purchased this building and are turning it into homes. It's in Chambersburg. So we got a chance to photograph that right before they started doing it, which is pretty neat. I always think this one, that really stands out to me. If I had to sum up my feelings on abandoned schools in a saying, that would probably be pretty close. Where there is no vision, the people perish, for those of you with poor eyesight like me. Again, some of the buildings are in really atrocious condition and can be pretty dangerous. One thing that you'll notice in this is in this classroom, the whole floor has fallen in. But part of the reason is because it is tongue and groove construction. You can see, if you look over on this side right here, see where the boards would fit into the wall. Water collects in that area. The boards rot around that area faster. So when they go, they can go bit by bit like this, or they can just pancake down onto the next floor and then on the floor beneath that, in which case you are, again, in a world of hurt if you're standing on them. This is Northeast Manual Training School, also known as Julia de Burgos, also known as Thomas A. Edison High School in Philadelphia. That was really also a point of pride for the city. They had people like Herbert Hoover, Albert Einstein, Babe Ruth, Amelia Earhart that came and spoke there. Really prestigious school, recently torn down. It is going to be a parking lot and a dollar store, I believe. So just as we build things with purpose, so too do we lose them. That says things about who we are as well. Some other institutions that I've been to would include this orphanage. Pennhurst State School and Hospital, often erroneously referred to as Pennhurst Asylum. It's not an asylum. Never was. Asylums were for people with mental illness. Institutions were for people with physical and developmental disabilities. Pennhurst was kind of known as one of the ones that was, pretty well known for its neglect and the abuses that went on there. There's a really kind of chilling documentary that you can watch on it called Suffer the Little Children that was really good. Some of the other places, such as Greystone Park Psychiatric Center in Jersey, that was recently torn down by good old Chris Christie, even though there were some really good reuse plans that they could have had that would have benefited the community a lot more than just ripping it down. A lot of times, too, people will say, oh, well, there's terrible memories in these places, like these solitary cells, for example. You can see the little food slots under the door. And people say, well, it's such a bleak history or whatever, maybe we should just tear it down and start again, which I think is just ridiculously wasteful. And that sort of superstitious thinking should not define what we do with our historic architecture, I believe. But, other buildings like this state hospital are in much, much worse condition. I always am kind of shocked that I don't see photographer skeletons, laying around, impaled on the punji pit right there. Because this place is, this is like on the 3rd or 4th floor of this building. And, you're probably up above what that is, in the previous picture. It's not like a directly one-to-one correlation there, but the point is that it's an extremely deadly building. This is Ellis Island. This is the Ellis Island. For those of you who have been there, there's a museum on it. It's a U-shape. It used to be that the whole place was abandoned. Lee Iacocca in the 80s invested in building the museum on the one side, and the center where the immigrants came in still abandoned. And then on the far side, they had the Communicable Disease Hospital, which actually was supposed to be really good. But if you came to America and you had scarlet fever, rubella, typhoid, they would send you over there. They would either send you home, or you'd go there, you'd get treatment, and then you'd go into the community, or you'd die, and you'd wind up in the autopsy theater right here. You can see these old, and this is kind of even pre-refrigerated morgue days right there with the wood slabs and everything. This hospital, the thing that I think is kind of crazy about that is the patterns. That there was a fire in this place, so those patterns are made by water dripping down the wall and from the ceiling. This is a retirement home. I've been to quite a few tuberculosis sanatoriums, such as this one, or this one, which is where they actually cured TB. There are people that are contentious out there, believe it or no, that will say, hey, they haven't completely cured TB. There's multi-drug resistant strains of it. I know, but this is the reason that 1 in 5 people that haven't died of it, because they developed the treatment for it that kept it from wiping out the astronomical numbers of people that it had been wiping out since prehistoric times. It did such a great job that it put itself out of business, essentially, which to me is kind of a shameful thing. I mean, could you imagine if, we had a hospital and they cured cancer? I mean, just all of it, all the various strains. And we said, okay, well, we don't really need that place anymore, and just left it fall into disrepair. That would actually be, less of a slight, I think, than this place. Prisons. This is Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. That, too, like the last place, is in my first book. I have a lot of horror stories that I could tell you guys about it, but time. So this building right here is a prison in Caldwell, New Jersey. And the thing about this one was that there are a lot of people that will view these pictures and when I talk about the horrible conditions that were in here, because I can't even tell you. I mean, again, like that's in the first book. Take a look at that. The conditions that were recorded in there were so bad that if you were to think of what hell would be like, it probably would be better than this. It was so overcrowded. They didn't have trained staff. They didn't have medications for people. There were bugs. There was no space for anyone. There was disgusting water pouring from the ceilings that, caused sores in people because it was so filthy. Pieces of the building were falling apart onto people. I could go on and on and on about this, and there are a lot of people out there that'll be like, well, if you can't do the crime, don't do the time. But the thing about this is that a number of the people that were in here hadn't even been convicted. They just couldn't pay their bond. So this prison And again, I had a bit of a longer thing where I talked about it last time, but you know, I am not very superstitious. People always ask me about ghosts. No, I haven't seen ghosts. I'll just throw that right out there. I have an active imagination. I think a number of the places are pretty spooky. I can picture all sorts of creepy monsters in them while I'm there by myself taking pictures, but I've never seen any, thank the Lord. This place, the reason that stands out is that in this prison, it was on an active campus for another prison. This used to be where the criminally insane were, and then they moved them to a newer facility. So the guy who was taking me around this was one of the people who worked at the other one, and he was really creeped out by this place. He was really like, you know, there are ghosts in this place. Here's some stories that people have told me about the ghosts that haunt this place. And at a certain point, it was kind of like, well, you know, I don't mean to be disrespectful or anything, but you work with criminally insane people. That's a scary day to me, you know? Like, I'll take the haunted building over the building that is full of actual criminally insane people. This building, also one of the creepier ones. I think prisons are really about the creepiest of the buildings. The thing that was really eerie about this one was there were a lot of people that were living in it still. A lot of people. And so, whereas with many buildings you have kind of heightened senses and you know, you're like, oh, what's that? A branch against the window or a pigeon flutters and it makes you hop. In this place you'd be like, what's that over there? Oh, it's a dude just watching me across the way. And then he'd kind of meld off in the shadows, and 5 or 10 minutes later you'd see somebody else on one of the other levels watching you that was a different person, constantly, all throughout the time I was there. I do not exaggerate. That was a really, really eerie place to be. This prison, the thing that I had sort of put in here that I thought was interesting about that one was there's a whole bunch of just scrawls all over the walls in the solitary cells in this. I actually had one that was a whole huge wall of just insane ramblings, but there were also a lot of large, prominent curse words on it. So I figured because C-SPAN is here with us tonight, I would spare you all. But the thing that really did, that I think was the eeriest of all of them, I can share with you is this. This was on an active campus too. Nobody else came into this building except for the people that were a part of the prison system. This is in the solitary cells. I have to imagine they did not like give them finger paints or anything, you know. I don't know what they wrote. That almost makes it a little eerier, you know, not knowing what it is and just seeing a little bit of bloody scrawl left on the wall. Some of the prisons and many of the other buildings I go into are in quite good condition. Sometimes people will contest whether they're actually abandoned based on like whether the lights are on or not, such as this place where the electricity is still there, but you know, I didn't just ask everybody to please go to their cells. So theaters, I've been to a number of theaters. I think they're right up there with churches in terms of scope and scale. For those of you that are of my generation and younger, I think, you know, we're seeing less and less of these places. They're much more rare, especially something like this one. I mean, granted, you know, in its condition, sure, but back in the day, I mean, this is a multi balcony theater. And yes, they actually are that steep. So when you were up at the top, it was really kind of vertigo inducing to see like 5 floors down to the stage. Some of the oddball ones, an aquarium. Philadelphia Ice House was not abandoned, caught fire, was abandoned then for about a week. This all was from the water that the firefighters sprayed on it. They tore it down shortly thereafter. Enchanted Forest in Ellicott City. A bank that has been converted to a bookstore and then abandoned again. So if any of you are bookworms and introverts like me, this seems like this would be a pretty cool place to have. This is the Masonic Temple in Cleveland. This is an Elks Lodge that I went to. Another question I frequently get is how I find these places. So to preempt that, I'm going to tell you, it's usually research, networking, and dumb luck. This was a dumb luck place. I just stumbled across it as I was driving. And all the doors were open. So I went in, and it was very creepy. Nobody really knew I was there. This room was a lot darker than even this picture gives you an idea of. That's at the top of the building, you know, pieces of the roof hanging off like that. Shaft of light coming in at the other end of the room, little thing on the wall there, and I was kind of squinting at it like, you know, what could that be? What is that thing over there? Happy nightmares, guys. It's even worse when you're in a creepy abandoned building and that's the thing across the room. And then when you see it, right as you're kind of piecing together and your brain is processing, It's like some sort of 1800s elk terminator that your foot goes through the floor. And so like any sane person, I stayed and photographed the place for the rest of the day, which is good because when I came back 3 months later, it was ripped in half, the building. They were tearing it down. This is AMARG, Aerospace Maintenance and Reclamation Group in Tucson, Arizona. That's where all the branches of all the services store their planes, from the Coast Guard to the U.S. Air Force. It is a very active facility. Don't do like, you know, that movie Can't Buy Me Love and try and sneak in there. Don't do that, because there are plenty of people with rifles wandering around that will ask you what you're doing. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the book, now that we've gone through the fact that I've been to a great variety of places. This is the Fallside Hotel. I figured I'd start off with this one. The Fallside started as a Treadway Hotel in 1957 in Niagara Falls, New York. And one of the things that I really look for in these places, and this is really important to me, particularly as I'm writing about them for the book, is not just what is the story of this particular place, but what is sort of, if that's a microcosm, what is the macrocosm that it says something about? So in this case, it really is tourism in Niagara Falls. Tourism is something that has gone back centuries. I mean, people, you know, settlers have recognized the scenic beauty of that area for a long time. But also for centuries, there's been this tug of war with the industries in the area. And so as this was being built, it was also a time when the industries were pretty much unregulated. They were kind of just dumping things into the Niagara Falls itself, a lot of toxins and whatnot. And there was also this huge influx of people because there's free electricity from the water, so they're building this huge new hydroelectric dam because the other one collapsed into the falls. So there's all these people coming into the town, all this industry, all this kind of lack of regulation. Also then a lot of urban renewal in that period too. So as you go into like the 60s, they sort of raised the whole downtown. They built this ill-advised Robert Moses State Parkway that even the mayor described as basically a Chinese wall separating the town from the thing that people came to see in the town. So this place did very well for a while. It was this is the Circle. It was the place to, you know, kind of be seen. A lot of politicians came here. In fact, JFK, when he was stumping, came and delivered a speech in front of this building. And as the years went on, it changed owners. It became, it was the Treadway in the beginning, then it was the Parkway, then it became a Ramada Inn, then a Days Inn, then it eventually wound up as the Fallside. So anyway, the way that this kind of parallels the town is that really the tourism part started taking a big hit right as the industries also started leaving. So you had scenarios like the Love Canal situation, which I really had very little idea of just how apocalyptically awful that was for the people that lived in that area. I mean, you had people's swimming pools in their backyard coming unmoored in pools of chemicals, and chemicals seeping into the people's basements, and kids going out to play in the playground and getting chemical burns and things like that. So you imagine if you're coming in to basically to go for your honeymoon, let's say, and to see the falls, and you first come in through all the husks of the old industrial buildings, and then you come into a town that has blooms of oil in the water and open lagoons of chemicals and things like that. It really wasn't a sight that you wanted to see. Also, then a lot of the people started leaving the town as the construction projects were finished. So you lost a good amount of the population, you lost the industries that were keeping the town afloat, and then the ripples from the industry really started hurting the tourism. So places like this really struggled after a while. And essentially, you know, the hotel closed in 2013. And at that point, it was already pretty kind of like bad condition. There were still some online reviews floating around about it that had all sorts of fun, awful stories about people going and staying in this hotel and how bad it was. The thing about this place is that some of the places that I go to I think are really architecturally and historically significant. I don't necessarily think this is like an architectural jewel that the area can't do without. The fact is right now that there's an investor that has torn down the majority of the building and is going to basically has built another hotel incorporating a little bit of it, but on that area. And actually, in that sense, it also symbolizes the overall fortunes of the area. And what I mean by that is that, you know, it has new investors. There are new people that are building hotels in it. This guy who has built it is somebody with a good deal of money and a great track record of kind of picking the trends of where areas are at. He's not a gambler, is what I'm trying to say. So the fact that he's investing in this community, and also the other great thing is the Robert Moses State Parkway is getting torn down, and they're going to be building basically like a kind of pedestrian park sort of thing there. So it's actually going to be a lot nicer when you go up there. But anyway, like I said, I kind of am looking for those things that tell a larger story than just the one place, right? And in this case, I think, you know, there's that parallel between the fortunes of the community in Niagara Falls. Taunton State Hospital. Taunton State Hospital, I had to put an asylum, and I had to. This asylum was opened in 1854 to relieve overcrowding at Worcester State Hospital. It was basically, I believe, the fifth hospital to be built on the Thomas Kirkbride plan, which was really popular at the time for these places. And the reason that this was really significant to me was that, honestly, I mean, I started all of this as somebody who worked in the mental health field. I worked in a private inpatient facility, and you know, which basically is the, you know, the kind of the stepchild, I guess, if you will, of the asylum system. You know, it's the privatized version of it. And I got really interested in what it was that made the asylums important and unique and interesting. And so I just read and read and read and read about them. And I kept hearing about one called Byberry, that or Philadelphia State Hospital, that had a really uniquely terrible history. And so I went there, and that's a whole long story for another presentation. But basically, these places were what really got me interested in abandoned buildings. I started going to other asylums. I started then from the asylums, I found schools and factories and all the other things I showed you earlier. Taunton obviously is not Philadelphia State Hospital, but I think some of the things that it shows, it has that sort of dichotomy that a lot of those places do. You have this really absolutely elegant and gorgeous architecture that I think symbolizes the commitment that people had to caring for the less fortunate. I mean, when these places were built, when Dorothea Dix was going around and campaigning for the state hospitals to be created, she wanted people that were mentally ill to not have to be in the streets and poorhouses and prisons and locked up in their relatives' attics. And this was something where there was a lot of idealism and ambition involved, you know, when they were building them. It was something that towns were really proud of. They petitioned for them. Taunton petitioned for this place. They had, you know, postcards that you would send out to people. Hey, look at this grand institution we have that defines our town, right? But then, as the years went on, underfunding, overcrowding, and understaffing really became problems in many of the places. Also, there's a number of things that, again, I don't have enough time to go into all the factors, but you know, one of the things is the rise of eugenics, which is kind of, you know, the seedling that the final solution grew out of. So this is basically people with inferior genes reproduce and then drag down the rest of society, so we should put them in places like this and remove them. You know, that was the predominant thinking that came in the asylums. And the other thing too is that, you know, we have this kind of view that, oh, it's people that were crazy, or if we're nicer than to put it that way, we would say mentally ill, you know. But really, that's a fluid kind of definition. I mean, there are all sorts of things that people would be committed for. Lou Reed, I believe, was committed to an asylum for being homosexual, you know. If you were too effeminate as a guy, or too masculine as a woman. If your husband wanted to cheat on you, but he didn't want the disgrace of trying to divorce you. If your brother wanted your land. I mean, there are so many different reasons. One of the ones that I think stood out the most to me was a guy who was a Turkish immigrant, and just people didn't understand him because he spoke Turkish. So he spent his life in an institution or an asylum. There's another one, actually, where it was one of the reasons for somebody being committed to Taunton was loss of interest in housework. Which is, in a way, I mean, it is very funny, but at the same time, not so much so if you're that person. So these are real people's stories. These people were put into these places often for their whole lives and forgotten. And so the thing about Taunton is, and the asylums in general, those are the places that really, I guess, kind of awakened me to feeling like, these are places that were rarely photographed when they were operational. They're rarely photographed after they were operational, and yet there's a lot of stories that need to be told, and they're just being left to fall apart like this. This is the kind of demolition by neglect principle. Long Beach. Long Beach, moving along to the next chapter, is basically a community in Connecticut. And it's sort of hard to describe exactly what happened to this community of sort of beach cottages unless you see a map. So basically on this map you'll see this here is Long Beach. This was Pleasure Beach, where they had an amusement park. Right up here you have Bridgeport. Right down here you have Stratford. And all along here you have Long Beach, right? So basically, the deal with Long Beach is, it is a peninsula. The only access that you had to those cottages or to Pleasure Beach was via this bridge that was built up here, because Stratford refused to make a road through here. So there's this long and kind of contentious history between Stratford and the Long Beach cottages. It seems like there was a lot of animosity in the town towards the cottages, and a number of times it seemed like they were, the chafing was because they did not want to provide them services that taxpayers kind of normally get, I mean, they were taxpayers as well. And in fact, they were leasing the property that they were on too for very low amounts, but they had built their houses on it. So anyway, the bridge that went over from Pleasure Beach had several fires. As the years went on, it got very rickety. And part of the reason why it was so easy to catch fire was this substance called creosote that was waterproofing, but also was very flammable. So anyway, a number of times there were fires. It was one of those things where there was kind of, a lot of talk about what are we going to do? Are we going to, this bridge is really rickety. We keep having to dump money into it, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in 1996, the final fire that really took the bridge out occurred. And at this point it was on a weekend, it was on Father's Day actually. You had all these people that were stranded in their homes with their visitors that had come over for the weekend, and they had no bridge to get off the island anymore. And so eventually they brought barges up and they took the people off. But it led to a greater question, which is, how do you get to your homes now if the bridge that you got out there on is no longer there, and Stratford's no longer is not going to let you build a bridge? So these people basically had two options. They could go on a boat to this rickety old dock, or they could walk the better part of a mile along that sandbar. And so one of the things that I really tried to do in this book was do a lot more interviews with people that were directly involved with these places, so it's not just my voice. And one of the stories that I think was particularly heartbreaking that I heard about was this girl whose grandparents lived there. And these are people that were, her dad was a retired, I believe he was like a municipal worker, and her mom was a factory worker. Some of the other places, like this place in particular, was a retired teacher's house. So they're not people that are on like their 8th home or anything that are living there. These are little plots of land that they're renting on the cheap, and then they built a little vacation home on. And she talked about how after the fire occurred, they basically had to, her whole family took wagons and dragged them along this sandbar until they got to the cottages and filled it up with whatever mementos they could fit in the wagons, and then had to drag them back along the beaches until they got to their car. We all have this idea of a social contract. If the electricity goes out, if the plumbing breaks, somebody's going to come in and fix it, right? Well, this is what happens when they don't. This is what happens when that social contract is violated. And we also like to think, well, you know what, if that happened to us, at least other people would help us out. And I hate to, give the sort of the nihilists among us fuel, but they really don't. People came out and looted the cottages, set them on fire, and it was really kind of an awful situation. I think the thing that I really felt when I was here, some places are really peaceful, some places are really beautiful, some are really scary, some are really sad. This one made me really angry, you know, because they're people's homes. And it was just so disrespectful that people were coming in and treating them that way when they had already got kicked so hard by just sort of fate in the town. So Randall Park Mall. And again, you know, based on time, there's a lot more interesting stuff, but, you know, I'm just kind of trying to give you an overview of some of these places. Randall Park Mall was the largest mall that was ever built at the time that it was, you know, that they did construction on it. It was eclipsed shortly after that by Mall of America. But anyway, this is in Randall Park, or I'm sorry, North Randall, Ohio. And North Randall is basically a town that used to have some racetracks in it, fairly small town. I think it's about 1,500 people when they built this place. This mall, at its peak, had 5,000 people visiting it a day as both workers and staff. There were 9,000 parking spaces in that parking lot. So when I went there, it's been out of business, and it had some really interesting kind of gems like this, which was the theater that had originally opened with it. And basically the theater was kind of walled off in a way. I mean, it was a men's clothing store that took over the front of it and used some of the areas as storage, but these old shotgun theaters were just left there, and nobody had really gone in them until, you know, this point where I was there, which was with the permission of the company that owned it, and they were demolishing it at the time. So the significance of Randall Park Mall, you know, it was really not only a big part of the area's economy, but also, I mean, it was kind of like it became the entire identity of the town. Like North Randall's logo was these shopping bags, you know. And so the thing that happens with a mall like this, and actually one of the reasons that you're seeing a lot of malls falter right now, is if you think about it, branding. You know, if a mall starts to go downhill, if it starts to get a reputation for crime, and I think there were really two reasons why this got a poor reputation. One reason was that a newer mall opened up in another area, and that started attracting the upscale clientele. Two was that there was actually, I think, some, you know, deserved reputation for crime. There was the interstate was right next to it, and you have this huge parking lot that's extraordinarily hard to police. So car theft happened quite a bit in the parking lot. You could just pull a car from the parking lot and drive off. The guy who invented, if any of you guys remember the club, that auto protection thing. The club was invented by a guy whose father-in-law's car was stolen from this parking lot. So there was some merit to that. But there also was a lot of bigotry in the community, and you still kind of see that now when you hear people talking about the mall, and it's pretty ugly, honestly. I mean, for example, one thing that people talk about when they talk about the crime in the area was this supposed race riot that happened at the mall. I'll be honest with you, I couldn't find anything about the race riot. I found plenty of people talking about a race riot and recollecting that a race riot happened. But as far as actual like newspaper evidence or coverage of this, nothing. The one thing that I did find in that time period was a balloon popped, and a huge flock of kids thought it was a gunshot, and they ran to the other end of the mall. So, you know, this is pre-internet days where you're kind of playing the telephone game with people a bit. So I'm really wondering if that event didn't somehow turn into that, you know, and that people were very uncomfortable with the fact, you know, you have these sort of white suburbanite shoppers going out there, and they're not the only ones that are at the mall. So unfortunately, like I said, it was really kind of, some of these situations are pretty ugly, and when you look at the perception that people had of the place being safe, it doesn't seem to quite jive up with what the actual area was. I mean, even the police chief in the area said that it was no more or less safe than any other mall. But perception's everything. Branding is everything, you know. So if you start to get a reputation as being unsafe, people aren't going to come out. And the other thing about a mall is if you start financially struggling, unlike, say, a strip mall where you can like demolish an area and build something else and call it a new name or whatever, you just have dead stores. Like, I don't know if any of you guys have ever been to a mall that's sagging and you're like, wow, there's a Subway, and then the whole rest of the wing is, it's kind of creepy in a way, right? You know? And so you enter this death spiral, and the bigger a mall is, the harder it is, I think, really for it to get out of that. So at the end, you really have some of these comical and awful stories, some of them both at the same time. Like in the end days, they had, people that got in, there was a lawsuit over the Easter rabbit got in a fight with one of the patrons, as did one of Santa's helpers at one of the points. But then there was another really ugly story where a guy who is one of the, Dillard's actually had a couple really ugly stories, but the one was a guy who was a security guard at Dillard's, and there was an alleged shoplifter, and to make a long story short, he basically sort of picked the guy up and just threw him right on his head on the concrete, and he died shortly after that. And so you had this, towards the end, you really did have these situations that were happening where it was kind of a frightening place to be. But yet there's still a lot of people that really remember this place fondly. And up until its final days, it really had become kind of a home for a lot of small businesses too. So I think it's, easy to kind of look at a place like this and only see one thing that's good or bad about it and kind of run with that. But this, by the way, is one of the areas, this is a little bit of a side tangent. This is one of the areas, it was one of two restaurants where they walled it off in like the 70s, the late 70s. And they were only discovered when they tore it open. So if you're ever walking around like King of Prussia Mall or whatever, and you see a whole stretch where it's just drywall, you kind of think to yourself, maybe there's something behind there. But anyway, this mall, I think, represents sort of the era of mega consumerism, and again, this idea in the book overall, Dismantling the Dream, refers to the American dream and kind of the failures that have happened and what that says about us as a people. So, you look at the shopping malls, they really had a very short lifespan. I mean, this place was born and died younger than I am. So, the game farm, the Catskill Game Farm is basically a very well-known place if you've gone there. It's funny, the current owner of it says, basically if you went to the Catskill Game Farm when you were a kid or took your family there, you're like, oh my God, it's the Catskill Game Farm, I can't believe it, and if you're somebody else, you have no idea who it was. But it was very significant to a lot of people. They basically started taking guests in 1945, and started as a private collection of animals. It was this guy named Lindemann basically was collecting them, and in 1945 he had so much demand for people to come in that he opened it as a park, and it just blew up. I mean, you had the baby boomer children, you had this kind of era of day trips and weekend trips and tourism. That area in the Catskills was really hot at that point, so people were going up there and taking their kiddos and loading them in the car and going up to this park where they could take them to, one of the key things, and they had a ton of exotic animals. Lindemann really believed in conservation, so he would go to areas where there were endangered species of animals and would basically bring them in, and they had a breeding ground where they would try and breed them. Really loved animals, but the thing that was really popular about it was that the kids could go into this feeding ground area and pet the, basically be right up with the deer and the sheep and the goats and stuff like that and feed them out of baby bottles. And it was really kind of a sweet thing. And for a long time, it really went well. And then basically it was, Lindemann sold it to his daughter Kathy Schultz in 1989. And that was kind of where things started to unravel a bit. Kathy Schultz was married to a guy with connections to exotic animal trading in Texas. That was kind of his business. And so he basically, a lot of the people that were buying the exotic animals at that time were in what's called canned hunts. And if you don't know what canned hunts are, that's probably good. I'm sorry to be the guy to tell you that, human nature is so bad. But basically, it would be where, say you have those animals that grew up and are no longer cute, and so they get sold to somebody who's a hunter, but that hunter is too lazy to go around and chase them down in the woods or anything like that. They basically had these animals in little pens and sometimes drugged, and the person would sort of drive up to them in a Jeep and execute them point blank and then put their head on the wall and tell their friends about this crazy adventure story they had where they caught them. It was really pretty hideous. And so as this was coming out, other zoos are starting to distance themselves from the Catskill Game Farm, like the San Diego Zoo, I recall, said they weren't going to have anything to do with them anymore. And this really became problematic for their image. And also, I mean, that era of, first of all, the Catskills was dying at that point as an attraction for people, so they weren't getting the amount of people in that way. The idea of like a chain link zoo was a little outdated, so even though people had gone there for generations, and also, I mean, it really just seems like Kathy and her kids weren't all that invested in it, you know? I mean, that's speculation, but you really do hear in the end about them not bringing new animals in, about the animals looking like they're unhappy and in not all that great of condition. So anyway, when the zoo closed, there was, this by the way is the owner's house in the game farm. When the zoo closed, there was this really kind of boiled over. And so there were a lot of people that were really trying to save these animals from being sold off to canned hunts. And one of the really neat stories is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Mark Echo, the clothing designer, but he actually, his logo is a rhinoceros. So they basically sort of appealed to him, and he wound up purchasing 2 of the rhinoceroses from somebody who was going to use them for a canned hunt, and he put them in a sanctuary with like a webcam so people could watch them as they lived out the rest of their rhinoceros lives, you know, which was really pretty terrific of him. So next time you're in the store and you see Mark Echo clothes, you know he's a good guy too. The oh, and one other thing I'd like to throw out there with the game farm though is just that basically the game farm is now currently owned by a couple that are really terrific and are hoping to turn it into like a bed and breakfast and an RV park and everything. And were very nice to not only let me come up there, but also gave a lot of information for the book as well. I'm going to skip through the Lee Plaza Hotel because I'm not sure where we're at for time here. I'll tell you just a little bit. Lee Plaza Hotel was basically built when Detroit was booming, and you know, Detroit was not in the top 10 list of cities in the U.S. In 1900, but by 1930 it seemed like it was going to take the number 3 spot from Philly. And almost as soon as it was built, it went into all sorts of sort of contentious legal problems and started to go downhill. It was bankrupt fairly quickly. So after that, the city took it over. They turned it into a retirement home for a while, and then it was closed. And at this point, it was closed in 1997. So at this point, it's kind of in pretty rough condition. But there are a lot of sort of parallels there to the boom of Detroit, and then the you know, the kind of downfall of its economy and the hemorrhaging of both jobs and citizens. Forest Haven was one of the ones that was really important to me in this book, probably one of the most awful stories that I've ever read. It was sort of like the more I read about it, the more terrible it was. Forest Haven was a facility that replaced the Washington Home for Colored Idiots, was the name of the place. So it was built in 1925, and it was essentially because the people in D.C. didn't want those people in their neighborhood. I mean, that was it, really. So they built this place kind of out in a rural setting. It was supposed to be, it's an institution. So an institution would be for people with physical and developmental disabilities. And it was supposed to be, I think, a pretty progressive facility. It was supposed to be a place where, you know, people would get training and medical care that they needed and things like that. But by the time it was closed, it was called the deadliest known example of institutional neglect in American history by the investigating attorney. One of the big problems that they had in this place, and oh my God, there were many. One of the big problems they had was due to improper feeding, which is basically, you know, you can blame the staff for that, but they're given 8 people to feed in the time that they could adequately feed one, and no training on how to properly feed them. So you have situations where the one guy was talking about his son in there, where they were pouring baby food down his throat until it came out his nose while he was laying down. If you feed people while they're laying down, particularly in such a manner, one of the things that can happen is they get aspirational pneumonia, which is where they ingest it into their lungs, and then, you know, basically they get an infection or choke to death. It's really horrible. But there are a lot of problems like these. In fact, this is one of the things, one of the places where I actually could not condense all of the awful stories that I found into a chapter. You know, it was like, you know, there were certain points where I was like, I think I've made the point on this. You know, I have to move on. But, you know, these are real people that are there. These are people that are confined and are basically getting really substandard care. It was really kind of hideous. And the other thing, too, about the aspirational pneumonia was that there was a point where somebody went to a judge and said, hey, all these people are dying of aspirational pneumonia. We'd like to earmark about $25,000 for training for people so that we can teach them how to properly feed the residents so that this doesn't happen. And the judge basically, I mean, not basically, he actually said, well, they're mentally retarded, so they're probably not that healthy anyway. It's really kind of a horrific thing. And I think the important thing is when you see these places and the actuality of them, and you understand that it's not like a legend or a ghost story or whatever. I mean, these are real people in this place. These are real lives that were lost. The thing that really stood out to me was, and there were a lot of really kind of unsettling experiences, but the one was when I was in the morgue of this place. And there's all this schmoo on the floor from the drop ceilings that have fallen down there, and, you know, paint and mud and all that. And as I was walking around them, I saw that there was a little pair of glasses on the floor. And then I looked and I saw another one, and I saw another one, and I was like, wow, there's a whole lot of little glasses on the floor, and these probably belong to dead kids, you know? I mean, it was just so many issues. But yet again, you know, you think of it. You think of these people coming to this place with their suitcases of things, and this very well could have been the last place that they wound up. You know, they may well not really have seen the whole rest of the world after that very much. So, and, oh, one other thing, too, is that we like to pat ourselves in the back and say, well, this place closed, so we're doing so much better now. We have people in community facilities. But actually, the community facilities really were pretty substandard, too, and there was quite a bit in that you know, end as well. The one thing that I will kind of point out is, you know, just to not leave it on a completely horrible note, is that the one moment of levity that I found in this place was that there was a beer-drinking, trumpet-playing rabbit that a magician gave to John F. Kennedy for Caroline. And he quickly regifted it to this hospital. So that was the one funny story that I found about this place, is that for a period of time they had a beer-drinking, trumpet-playing rabbit. I'm going to skip on by Fort Pitt casting just because of time here. That's in Pittsburgh. Was basically doomed by you know, a lot of strife between the labor and the management, and just destroyed the town. In fact, the last thing that Fort Pitt was used for after it closed was as an incinerator to burn the houses of the workers that had lost their jobs there. You know, pretty awful. Schenley High School, I'm also, like I said, I want to get to a Q&A here, so I'm going to kind of sprint through some of these. Schenley High School was one that was really important to me because this was the most expensive public school that was ever built at the time. It was the first school to cost over $1 million. It was called the Pride of Pittsburgh, and they really were proud of it. It's a triangular footprint, so that is not camera trickery right there. That's what it looks like. Basically, you know, it kind of had its ups and downs as the year went on. The thing that really doomed it was that in 2002 they had this window replacement that caused a lot of humidity in the school, which affected the plaster. Pieces of plaster started falling out. So then they said, okay, well, if we're going to fix that, maybe we should fix the electrical systems. Maybe we should fix the mechanical systems. Maybe we should fix the air systems. And then they did, and you can see right here, actually, areas where they patched it up and areas where it has fallen off. And then they did a test where they basically discovered, oh, there's a fairly high concentration of asbestos in there. So then all of a sudden it was really big concern, and they're getting to a point where they're thinking this is something that we can't really afford to do. What's interesting, though, is so they closed the school, very contentious, community's really upset about it because obviously why wouldn't you be? This was a huge investment in the community and such a huge part of people's lives. Later reports said that the asbestos was actually vastly overstated in the school. So very interesting, kind of weird. Sold for condos. I'm not saying that I think that there was, in what I read, I don't necessarily think that it was a a case of some sort of treacherous plot. It was just more, it seemed like a bit of a comedy of errors, you know? And so this really great public institution is lost to the public and sold to the private. However, I will say that the developers have really been all about retaining the character of the building. They seem like they're quite nice people. I've talked to them too. Can't really blame them for the situation that brought about the closure. So this place was closed in 2008. And if you look now, I mean, one of the things, this is kind of a bigger, and it, by the way, had a brand new auditorium when it closed too. One of the things that this, I think, shows a larger example of, Pennsylvania schools are really in a perilous position with the constant budget crises, you know, and they're always, you know, kind of having to borrow money to keep the lights on and stuff, and there are a lot of schools that are closing. This is a huge problem in Philadelphia as well, but Pittsburgh is struggling with it too. The Victory and Variety theaters are two different theaters that are in Cleveland. Well, no, wait a minute. In Holyoke, Massachusetts, that's where the Victory is, and the Variety is in Cleveland. And there are these beautiful theaters, and kind of what this chapter was about was the various reasons that they went out of business over the years, because you really do have these kind of grand theaters. The Variety was home to not only a bunch of films over its time, but also a lot of musical acts. They had some really great groups there, like, you know, Slayer and Motorhead and Metallica and R.E.M. And actually, Motorhead was the one that, you know, as legend has it, played so loud that plaster rained from the ceiling. And really, this caused a lot of problems in the community. So it was shut down due to noise complaints. It operated briefly after that as the Cleveland Wrestleplex, and then was closed. And the thing that it shares in common with the Victory Theater in Massachusetts is they both were, I mean, the Victory Theater was one of the richest cities per capita in the U.S. They had all these mills and all these immigrants coming in. They had like 7 different theaters there, you know. And both of them were in pretty affluent areas that just kind of took a nosedive. I mean, in the Victory's case, all the mills just went south right out the bottom of the country. And so you have this area that suddenly is very poor, and they actually lost a lot of their architectural heritage during the urban renewal period, not because they were rebuilding, but because people were burning the buildings for insurance. So the group that has this and the group that has the other theater, both of them are fighting these kind of tooth and nail battles, and the theaters represent a revitalization of their area. I mean, one of the things that people often forget is that Broadway was basically, pardon me for just a moment here, the theaters on Broadway were once endangered too in the 60s and 70s. And so there were a lot of them that were torn down, and at that point they're like adult theaters, they had peep shows, things like that. But now, you know, because they've been revitalized, in 2012 to 2013, they sustained 87,000 jobs and generated $11.9 billion. So, you know, it's not just this pipe dream that these towns are really hoping that by bringing the theaters back, it'll start generating some economy in that area. And that's why it's very important to them. The SS United States, again, I'm going to kind of sprint through here quick, but this was the fastest ocean liner ever built. It was basically said to go between 38 and 44 knots, so approximately 44 miles an hour. It was also the largest liner built on U.S. soil. It's just about 100 feet longer than the Titanic. You have celebrities that were on it, such as, and presidents, including JFK, Clinton, Eisenhower, Truman, John Wayne, Elizabeth Taylor, Marlon Brando, Judy Garland, Grace Kelly. I could keep going on and on. There were a lot of them. So, and this is really only between 1952 and 1969, which were the years that it was in use. After it was out of use, it was a big problem because it was full of asbestos. The owner, or the guy who designed it, William Gibbs, was terrified of fire. And one of the reasons was the infamous Morro Castle fire, which if you haven't heard about that, oh my God, read about it. It's the most terrifying thing. So you get an idea that he would fill this up with asbestos so that, you know, that same thing wouldn't happen to this ship. So after it was decommissioned, there was this big sort of, they were trying to take it to different ports. Nobody wanted anything to do with it or all the asbestos. They finally took it and gutted it. So right now, you know, you have an intact exterior, but the interior is really pretty barren. By the way, a fun thing, this is little Canada goose here. And that's its Canada goose friend right there, watching out. It's kind of a sassy thing. But anyway, you look at interiors like this, there are a lot of people out there that say, well, this is kind of a rust bucket, we should sink it for a reef. You know, they'd never be able to get that back. I would beg to differ. It's actually in a really good structural condition, and the fact that the interior has been gutted would put it in a pretty good condition for rehabilitating it. Crystal Cruise recently optioned it, you know, and basically said they were going to pay the mooring fees for it. And then ultimately decided that they weren't going to restore it as they had hoped. So the conservancy that owns it now is sort of back to square one, you know, in terms of trying to figure out where to go with it. But it's one of those things that if you ever go down, you know, by IKEA, you see it across there and it's gorgeous. That's one of two that are left. So we will move along to Vulture City. Vulture City was the most profitable mine in Arizona's history. It ran from 1863 to 1942 and is said to generate anywhere between 30 and 200 million in gold. So there's basically this smaller gold rush in Arizona after the one in California. And you know, the thing that you really read about with this, and again, I'm going to kind of skim over a little bit with this, but that was really kind of interesting is just, you know, reading these old miners' newspapers from the late 1800s, you know, and hearing these stories about the Native American raids and such, you know, and you really think, wow, why would they do that? You know, that sounds so scary for them. And then you basically read that, you know, from 1845 to 1870, about 80% of the Native American population were slaughtered. And so when there was the gold rush in California, for example, you know, the state actually paid bounties for the scalps of Native American men, women, and children. So when this started to move over to Arizona and these same people are showing up and diverting their water and messing with the herds and displacing people, you know, I'm sure that they were quite scared, as they really should have been, you know, because that was really kind of a terrible thing. This mine caused a lot of bloodshed. And actually, the one thing, too, by the way, it helped fund the foundation of Phoenix, Arizona. But anyway, the guy who found it was sort of swindled out of it and wound up committing suicide. So it was kind of a you know, a dark story, but interesting, because you would think if you found like this great mine that had all this gold in it, that life would just be wonderful forever, you know, but not so much. So the last one here, and then we'll go to a quick Q&A, is Gary, Indiana. Gary is not, you know, it's a town. It's a town in which 78,000 people live in. So, you know, calling it abandoned really is unfair. However, basically, you know, it's lost about 100,000 people since 1960. And in a 2015 survey, there were 13,000 blighted properties there, which is over a third of the structures that are there. So it's sort of like a little mini Detroit in that sense. I mean, you just drive around and it's block after block after block after block of these places. And, you know, I think one of the things that's really important when you view these places is not, you know, just this sort of, let's take this in, the aesthetics of it. Wow, it sure is neat to see ruins. I mean, you're looking at real losses for real people. These are 78,000 people that live in a community that is falling apart like this, and sort of the ruins of what was once a great town. And there are a lot of reasons that, you know, this town is going through this. I think one of the biggest ones is just the overall collapse of steel. You know, the Gary Works plant that was there started to decline at about the same time that a lot of other ones like Bethlehem Steel and Homestead did. And a big part of the reason for that was because after World War II, we were kind of the main person out there, the main country out there that was producing steel. But as other countries rebuilt, they had more modern facilities, and we weren't modernizing our own. So American Steel couldn't really keep up. So the jobs left. You know, there was a lot of racial strife in this town. This city had, Richard Hatcher was one of the first African-American mayors of like a large city. And he was actually really blamed for a lot of what happened here, which I personally think is, I mean, I don't know if he was a great mayor or not. You know, I've read about him, and that's one of those things that's so polarized that it's hard to pull it apart. But stepping back from the whole, you know, you love him, you hate him stuff. I mean, objectively, the steel industry was collapsing at that point. Objectively, a lot of the white businesses said, you know what, we're done, we're leaving. And they pulled out to the suburbs, and the whole place's economy just collapsed. It was really, I mean, for a while it was a melting pot of immigrants, and, but it was also kind of a KKK stronghold. So you really had a lot of conflict, and at the point where that happened, it just really devastated the town. This is something where you're seeing, the effects of this kind of thing all across the U.S., though, particularly the deindustrialization. But, these had these really just grand, grand buildings there. That is the Memorial Auditorium, and that's just the front. The back is burned off. There was a great fire that basically destroyed that, but Sinatra performed there. This was the town where the Jackson 5 hailed from, too. But anyway, in 1993, Gary was called the murder capital of the United States. It had 3 times the murder rate of Chicago. Crime is still not great there. It's losing cops to other communities that are safer and pay better. And I think really in a lot of ways, this is their post office, by the way, it represents our kind of modern crisis, which is finding an identity and a way to move forward when the things that created a town, that sustained a town are gone. Where do you go from there, You kind of can't just leave the whole place fall apart and become this third world country, but what are the alternatives? So I think it's really important that we look at it and address it, not just out of respect for the residents that are there, but also, for ourselves in our own cities. And I'm going to kind of leave on this. This was sort of the last image that I ended the book on. And what really stood out to me was just, when I went here and I kind of looked at that for about 10 minutes, and I was just looking at all the faces of all the kids that went to one of the schools. And the schools were really one of the big, kind of the pride of Gary, And you just think about all these kids that went to this closed school and then went out into this community where they don't have jobs, they don't have safety, they don't necessarily have economic opportunity or a way to leave there. They're in a place that's in ruins. And when you look at the people's faces, it really kind of drives home the human cost of all of this. But again, I mean, there are people that are still out there that are decent people that live there and work there and are trying to make the place better. And for the bad reputation that it has, everybody that I met there was actually really terrific, But anyway, so that is basically the presentation on my book. And if you get a moment and look at this, the one thing you can really do to help if you enjoy the book is review. Reviews are so important, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Goodreads. That is a huge, huge help. So anyway, with that, thank you so much for coming. And I'd love to take your questions. And if you will, when you ask a question, if you just wait for a moment for them to get the boom mic over you. Thank you so much. Any questions? Hang on just a second.
Have any of your places that you visit been fixed up? Have you gone back to see them fixed up, or has any been, I guess the word flipped, that you've gone back and revisited?
Yeah, actually, I mean, there have been quite a few places that have been restored. The majority have not. I mean, the majority are either still abandoned or have been torn down, but absolutely, there are a number of places. Shenley would be a good example of one. The theaters are a good example where they're in the process of trying to do that now. The game farm, they're trying to sort of build that back up, but there are absolutely places. In fact, there are places that you wouldn't even know of in your community that are kind of the gems. For example, the Ellis Island Museum. You would go in that and not necessarily ever think that was an abandoned site. But more to the point in what you're asking, if I've been to particular places like that, yes, I have. There have been quite a few, and it really is heartening to see. I think one of the neatest things is kind of being able to photograph the before and after with that. And for example, one of the other places, the Elk Lodge, is a little bit different in that they tore the building down. But I just got an email from the developer of that that had torn it down and is using, it actually, unbeknownst to me, saved quite a few of the architectural features and is using them in the building that they're putting in that place, and invited me up to see it. So it's going to be pretty neat kind of going to see where all of the things that they saved from the building are going in. Thank you.
Just as from an artistic perspective, do you do anything to the sites before you photograph them? Any staging of things, or do you just kind of do it as you find it?
I don't like to stage things. I personally think that that's kind of cheating. I like to leave things as I find them. So that's not to say that somebody else may not have, moved a chair out into a hallway or something. There are certainly ones where the idea of a place being a time capsule, I think, is kind of a bit of a myth. If you find a place like that, it's quite rare. They are out there, and I've been to a few, but usually you have people that move things around here, there, but I don't particularly care for doing it. The one thing that I would do, and I don't really feel bad about this, is, like, let's say that somebody's thrown a water bottle or something, because that isn't really a part of what the building is or the authenticity of it. Things like that where somebody just throws some trash on the floor, I don't feel too bad about moving that. But no, I don't particularly like, staging a shot, because it just feels a little, like, inauthentic to me. Any other questions?
It seems that there ought to be some kind of deterrence to this happening. Are there any communities that don't allow the abandonment of these beautiful structures? And it's blight, and all of that.
I think that it's kind of a community by community thing. And it's also a decade by decade thing, mayor by mayor thing, So, for example, you have places like Niagara Falls, New York, where they raised a huge chunk of the downtown during the urban renewal period. But then I just presented in Salem University in North Carolina, and that's like this gorgeously preserved town that they're very, very, very protective of the historic character. I think as we go on, that's going to be something that's going to be increasingly important and an increasing draw. And if you look, if any of you guys are preservation-minded folks, Philadelphia, we're always fighting that battle. And I hate to say, but preservation loses a lot to money. It loses a lot, and we have lost a lot of treasures here. But I think in the long term, what you really see is that those places that define an area are what draw people to an area. Why go to a place if it's just the same Walmarts and condos and, Applebee's that you can go to anywhere else? So, I think there are a number of communities where they really have that sort of foresight, and they're trying to preserve those things, and typically that's a really good investment for them. But there are a lot of other places, and again, I hate to say it, but I think Philadelphia is going through a real low in the last at least 10 years or so in terms of just demolishing places that they have no right. The Jewelers Row is kind of the big fight of the moment, that, they're looking at leveling that and, some of the buildings there and making condos, and that's just kind of a big back and forth. So to answer your question, it'd be hard to pick, town by town, historic designation by historic designation. It's just something that it seems like there's not really a particularly cohesive plan. It's just something, this area fights and is successful, this area fights and they lose. So, hang on just a second, let me see.
At this stage in your career, are building owners fairly open to letting you come in, or is it a tough battle to get into the...
It is a lot of work. I'm lucky that I think I have a bit more cachet than I did when I first started. I have like 2 books now, so I can kind of wave that around. I can't really over the phone, but you know what I mean. That is something that helps, but it's still not easy. It still is one of those things where you really have kind of feast or famine periods. So, for example, my sister actually contacted Randall Park Mall on my behalf. She was helping me kind of do some work on that, and the owner was familiar with my photography and had seen it in an article and kind of wanted to have me up. Great, that was so easy. I ran right up there to try and do it before he changed his mind. Places like the Catskill Game Farm, were ones where I had just a really good, easy time doing that. The owners were really nice. Then there were places like the SS United States where, that was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, this is pre-Conservancy days when Norwegian owned it, So, and at this point, I mean, I would say when I started off, if I had 5 to 10% success rate, that was really great, And now maybe I have like 15 to 20% success rate. So it's better, but it's still a lot of work and a lot of failures and, a lot of heartache when you put a lot of work into a place and really hope to see it and you don't get to.
Is liability the big concern, do you think? Or
You would ask if liability was the big concern. I think that is one of the concerns, but sometimes people don't care about that. I mean, they might say, well, liability, and we're worried about that. And you say, okay, well, I have insurance. I can get you a certificate. And they're like, that was just a thing I was telling you to say no, So, I mean, the other thing, too, that is there's a lot more interest in these places, and that's been really problematic, I think, for a lot of property owners. It's been really problematic. So there have been places that have been torn down because of so many people breaking into them. At least that was one of the reasons that they brought up for it. And so I think, particularly with the interest, we've passed the point where it used to be that, you would be in a place, say you wander onto a property and you're taking pictures of it. In the days of yore, you might run into a property owner and they might say, oh, how quaint and odd that you are interested in taking pictures of this old building. That's really strange, but somewhat endearing, so I'll let you go do that. Whereas now I think people are used to people sneaking into places and taking pictures. And there is a very real concern about theft, vandalism, arson, liability. So I think there's also a lot less tolerance for that too. I think that they're, they view people that are interested in the places as somewhat of a drain on their resources and time and a threat. And so it can be pretty difficult. But yeah, that's a case-by-case basis. I can take one more. Did we have one more question? Sure.
I grew up right around where White Marsh Hall used to be, and I think they demolished it when I was 2. And it's one of those places that I wish I had been able to just sort of explore around. Are there any places like that for you?
Oh, there are so many places like that. There are so many places that I wish I were able to get to and I would love to go to. I mean, I think the really big thing that I'd like to do in the years to come is kind of to explore more abroad, because I just see these gorgeous pictures of places that have a whole different timeline, 15th century chateaus, or places that are hospitals that have been around for centuries that I'd love to get to. So I think the big thing is to go to Europe and beyond is sort of what I'd like to do in the future. So with that, thank you again all so much for being here. I hope you'll join me out there for the reception, and I really appreciate you spending your time with me this Friday evening. Thank you.
If everyone will wait just one moment, Matt's going to pick out the raffle winner.
Thank you, Olivia. Entirely new collection of images, so we'll experience it together. This is a China plant that I've been to. All of those various forms there are used to make the plates and dishes. They're quite heavy. That's why they're sinking through the floor. You're looking at Bethlehem Steel's gas blowing room right there. If you go out to get Bethlehem Steel now, you can see the steel stacks and all the restoration work that they did. If you go up on the Hoover Mason trestle, you can look down into this room. But when I went there in like 2008, 2009, the whole facility was completely abandoned. This is Alcoa Aluminum, one of the locations in my first book. That's Frederick, Maryland. This is the Fisher Body Plant in Detroit. So if you ever see Body by Fisher stamped on your car, that's where they did it. Apparently, this is like 2008-ish when I took this. Apparently, a good chunk of the facade of that fell off. This is a lime quarry in Marietta, Pennsylvania. The Hershey Chocolate Factory. That one is one that is really kind of a poignant one for me, because I spent a good portion of my youth growing up in Hershey, and my father worked there. He didn't work in the factory, he worked in the IT section, but still, really integral to the identity of the town. They did build a newer facility, so it's not like they went bankrupt or something, but this is the iconic one that was, Milton Hershey's baby when he founded it. This is the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, one of the recent ones that I photographed. Major urban newspaper, they moved their offices out into the suburbs. So basically, this whole facility, which has these 3-story printing machines like this, is being dismantled as we speak. This is Bell Labs. That's in my first book. Bell Labs is the place that you have to thank for a myriad of technologies, including satellite, microwave, cellular technology, laser technology. They're the ones who developed the Holmdel horn, which is what they verified the Big Bang with.
Lectured on abandoned spaces and mental health history for numerous institutions, been profiled in various publications and on various media. And his website, Abandoned America, has gained international attention and is considered one of the leading collections of images of abandoned spaces on the internet. But we're here today to launch Matthew's latest book of Abandoned America, second volume. And as you look through these images, both in print and in the book, you will see a very accomplished eye in terms of creating a photograph within a rectangle. Matthew's vision really gets to the heart of the matter in terms of composition, in terms of color, and of course, in terms of the content. And that's what's really important about the work. There are many people who have and continue to photograph abandoned spaces. And you might have a beautiful image of an abstract pattern of paint on a wall or an abandoned glove left on a factory floor. But what Matthew does is remind us of the lives that once inhabited these spaces. The only thing that is constant in our lives is change. None of these spaces, industries, homes, hospitals, was necessarily meant to last forever, nor does anything particularly last forever. But it's how we treat these places, what we expect out of them, and how we plan for the institutions that succeed them. It's especially appropriate in this political campaign season. I grew up in upstate Pennsylvania in coal mining country. The coal industry has been disappearing for years. Despite what politicians will say, coal is not coming back. There's nothing you can do to save it. It is a victim of improving technologies, of market forces that drive down the price of coal. And certainly for the many miners who are losing their jobs, we have to figure out how to retrain them and get them to industries that need them. But for all those miners who had black lung, who were injured, had friends, family members killed in the mines, it's not that bad a thing on one level. Same with factory jobs. We need to think about what the future holds and how we can make that happen. And personally, I think that Matt's photographs really show us the elegance of what has been, but leaves us with that question of what will follow. My pleasure to introduce Matthew Christopher.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm really grateful to have all of you here. It means a lot to me that you'd come out and sort of share this evening with me. So I'm excited to talk to you about my new book. Before I do, I have several people to thank. I mean, I have actually a million people to thank, but a few that will keep the evening, running on schedule. I'd like to thank my family and my lovely fiancée, Olivia, both of whom have helped tremendously with it.
Well, hello and welcome. I'm Stephen Perloff, the editor of the Photo Review. And before I start the introduction, I will remind you of several things. We are filming this evening. Steven Spielberg himself, I think. I'm also to remind you to turn off your cell phones. And lastly, we will hold questions till the end of Matthew's presentation. And when you ask a question, wait for them to bring a mic to you, because if you just shout it out, they can't really hear you. Well, I'll tell you just a bit about the photo review, since this is the commercial before the main event. The Photo Review is a nonprofit journal of photography, founded in 1976, which means this is our 40th anniversary. We publish a newsletter which lists photography exhibitions throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and news about photography from around the world. And we also have a journal that has exhibition reviews, book reviews, essays, and publishes the winners of our annual competition. Well, most of you probably know Matthew, so I will just give a brief introduction. Matthew has had an interest in abandoned sites since he was a child. We won't go into the psychology of that, but all good. But he started documenting them a decade ago while researching the decline of the state hospital system. After Matthew received his MFA from the Rochester Institute of Technology, he has shown his work in gallery shows across the country.
This event. I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event. Those sponsors are Entertaining Grace. Entertaining Grace, if you're looking at the lovely setup out there and the catering and all the decorations and everything, that is Entertaining Grace. So you can look up Entertaining Grace online, and if you have any wonderful events that you would like to have, they're the ones to do it. The Athenaeum of Philadelphia, and Partners for Sacred Places. Also, our community partner, the Gershman Y. Obviously, I'd love to thank the Photo Review and Stephen Perloff for coming out and being a part of this evening. That is really an honor to me. The sites like Artblog and InLiquid that helped get the word out about the event. All of you who have come out here, supported the book, the work, people who have reviewed the book, and people who are here to share this evening with me. Also, Eric O'Hara and Danielle Burrows, who both helped me quite a bit with editing the book, and C-SPAN for being here tonight with us, especially Rich, who held the door for us about 10 million times today as we were bringing things in and out. Thank you, Rich. So anyway, this is pretty great night, not just in terms of the book being out and finally done, which I have to tell you that is pretty great for me, not as some sort of big life accomplishment, but just being finished with it because it was a lot of work. But also, this is the 10-year anniversary of my website. So my website, Abandoned America, which is where we got the title for the books that I have, Dismantling the Dream, which is the current one, and Age of Consequences, which was my first book. That is basically a catalog of all the different sites that I've been to, or at least as many of them as I've processed and have added online. So it's kind of a never-ending thing that I'm building. Usually in the beginning, I like to give people a little bit of an idea just to give you some of the breadth of the places that I've been to. This is an entire